If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense Report.
Hear ye, come one, come all. You are listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel Nicolas and Darnell Samuels.
Brother, we right back at it, hitting the same topic, but for a special
Whose land
reason.
is it anyway?
Part two? Or
Part two, or extended, extra change, spare change, whatever you want to call it. We definitely had to address this or unpack it further because we got feedback from a listener. A little bit of criticism on some things that we missed.
Straight into the inbox, sixcentsreport@gmail.com.
Yeah. You know, and it was like a well written, well thought out response. And so, you know, of course, you know, me and you, Joel, we could do it and just read off his points and assume what he was going to say. But we figured we'd bring the guy on to unpack his ideas. So Joseph, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate that so much.
Yeah.
Hi Darnell. Hi Joel. What's up?
Yeah.
Yes. So welcome. This is a first where we've brought a Sixth Center on to give us their 2 cents, and your response was really good, and it gave us some other things to think about and spots where we missed. But before we get into that, do you want to tell the audience a bit about yourself?
Okay, yeah, I could definitely do that.
Yeah, like how you know Darnell.
We went to the same school, right? We did our undergrad together in 2015 to 2019. That was pretty cool. Yeah, we were both history majors. We took a couple classes together. I just finished in 2019. I work, so I wasn't able to always listen to all the shows that you guys been producing. But I was like, man, I'm kind of bored. What do I got to do? Well, let me listen to some Sixth Sense reports. So I'm scrolling through the list and I see, native stuff. Okay, I like this stuff because I actually really love this issue. I think it's amazing. And I was really happy you guys were, the way you introduced the last podcast, you were mentioning that, like, hey, this is the issue that we just don't want to talk about it, right? And I think it's really cool that you guys are talking about that. As I said, I'm Joseph or Alex, whichever one you want to call me. I grew up in Austria. I came here as an immigrant. I lived in various parts of Scarborough, Markham, Pickering, Georgina, York region. I'm a pretty cultured person, and I practice the Christian faith, and I love my faith, and I'm happy to be on this show.
Okay, cool. Yes, so welcome. So for the listeners, four of Joseph's issues were, one of the issues was the major issue being interpretation of legally signed documents versus property rights. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about his issue with how Joel used the term Christian as a status. And then he talked, another one of Joseph's points was indigenous self-government. And then his last point was, is the pursuit of property sinful? And so we'll get to unpack those. And for those of you who are listening now and didn't listen to the previous episode, shame on you.
So I would say probably pause this, go back, listen. It probably will contextualize some of the conversation.
Yes. So listen to episode 98 and then come back to this one. And so let's get into it. So Joseph, your first point, you were talking about the issue not being, when it comes to property rights, it's not necessarily property rights, but it's interpretation of documents. You want to expound on that?
Yeah, I could definitely do that. I know you guys were talking about the property rights in the previous podcast, in the previous episode, and I understand where you guys were coming from, but also we have to, like I mentioned, one of the books that I read, Donald Smith, Peter Jones, and some of these historians who studied like the natives issues. Some of these land giveaways, they were they were signed away, right? They were by legal documents. And I think what we also got to address is not just the idea of property rights, but understanding is what's actually being signed. So I think this also defining what is actually being given away. So in our understanding in our Western culture is like it's not official until it's actually signed. So I think that's very important. And going back and actually seeing what was actually given away, I think that's a great place to also start before we even get into the whole idea of property rights. See how we actually define property at that current time. Like, what was the British interpretation of property? What was the Native interpretation of property? Because I think that's where the initial confusion started. And if we could start there, that would probably help the discussion, and also it expanded more. That's where I was kind of getting that with that point.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting, like, it's an interesting aspect of it. My first take one of the first sort of, I don't want to say negative or counter thoughts, but like, I think it's good to understand the scenario that occurred. I don't know that it helps us resolve where we are today. Because the reason I say that is, let's just say that they got a raw deal. They totally ripped them off. Arguably, like Darnell was sort of making the point that like, oh, well, we're going to use the land more productively. And the reason why I say it doesn't help resolve today is because I think too much of the conversation could move to, well, they took this land and they turned it into this, and it now has this value, but it sort of removes the idea that like, it's the fact that a different group of people owned the land that it's now that's potentially the reason it's so valuable. It's not because the land itself inherently had the value. So again, I'm not discrediting anything you're saying. I think it is valuable. I think that if we try to pull that forward, we have problems in terms of trying to resolve today's problem.
Yeah. I would ask you, Joseph, would you say that like the natives were ripped off? Would you say like they didn't know what they were getting into? Would you argue that?
Like from what I have read, like again, I'm using that Donald Smith biography.
Yeah,
I was telling you guys, like from the way he interpreted and the way that I understand the book is that I don't think the British were like in that one scenario that happened in after the War of 1812. The British came and said, "Hey, your people are going to get wiped out anyway. Like there's alcohol issues, and there's a lot of people coming in from the States into your area. Why not work with us?" And we'll provide you water, and we'll provide you, like, that's why I kind of want to go back. And I want to go back and see what was actually written on those papers. Like, what was the British side of that and that in those clauses? Because from my understanding, they were supposed to give them water, supposed to give them food. They were going to have plentiful of resources for a long time. And I don't think that's a bad deal for the natives, but I don't think we're upholding our end of the clauses. And I think that's why going back and seeing what was actually signed, I want to see that too. I want to see what was actually in those clauses, because we're students of history. We love history. Basically, history was just reading what the treaties were, reading what these clauses were in these treaties and how we interpret that. That's what I was trying to get at with that point. And was it a bad deal? I think in some sense we could definitely argue that it was, but I think for some it was also a good deal too. I think there's still natives around. I think much of that part of that reason was because that we still managed to for the race to survive, I guess, in that sense. I hope that makes sense.
I think that's actually, like, now that you clarified it a little bit better, I think we didn't really get into this in the show, but I would say contract rights and property rights go very well hand in hand. So, the idea that you're getting into what were the terms and conditions, i.e. what was the contract, I think is a very valid point. And then saying who violated the contract. Or did someone violate the contract? Did they not uphold their end of the deal? Consequently, what would we normally do? Well, I mean, let's say arbitration or something along those lines, where you would value, okay, how do you make that person whole for not upholding your end of the deal? I think that is a way to some extent pull it forward. But it's let's say they violated the deal in 1850. How do you even try to rectify that 150 years later?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Joel. And from what I've studied is that, like, for the Robinson Treaty of 1850, there were numerous renegotiations going on, and that there were like 20 chiefs present at the time to do the negotiations for this treaty. So it kind of insinuates like, okay, well, there were terms that were presented and the natives didn't take the first offer they got, and they were arguing for other things, and it was going back and forth. And so even then, prior to 1850, Indigenous people had dealings with, this isn't the first time dealing with the British. And so we have to look at all treaty negotiations as independent and not group them all together. And so like, even when you think about like a contract, like, especially if you've done like a contract with somebody, whether as a photographer or podcast and whatever the case may be, there's always these little loopholes or things that are not said clearly, or a little term or phrase left out that can leave things open to interpretation. And sometimes we think that, these documents are perfectly written and, both parties had their lawyers there to go through with a fine-tooth comb. You know what I mean?
And even if they do, this is why like really, really smart people with contracts add arbitration, because arbitration is a way to avoid the worst option, which is the government court system. Arbitration essentially is private court system. You're going to have, independent people review the terms, and then when there's a dispute over the contract, and let's, for argument's sake, in terms of what Darnell's saying, the dispute is something that the contract sort of vaguely refers to or doesn't explicitly address. And so let's use COVID as a really good example. Hey, COVID says the government has to shut down my company. I can't fulfill my contract to you. Having an arbitrator look at that to go, okay, neither one of you is in, you essentially, maybe the resolution is we put the contract on hold until the government gets out of the way again, right? But these are things that, like, my point to say that is exactly what you're talking about is addressed by bringing arbitration into the contract, because it's almost inevitable. There's going to be either a dispute or something that you didn't address that comes up and has to be, the contract doesn't quite resolve that problem.
I think part of the issue is when you look at the Indian Act, and when you look at like technically 1850, this is before Confederation, right? So even like when you look at jurisdictions changing, right? And now you're like, okay, wait a minute. So are we still going to honor this contract? And like the last point I left went on last episode with my 2 cents, and I said, you know what? At the end of the day, like treaties are covenants, and they are bound by your word, right? And your word is your bond. But the problem is the government isn't a person. Government's not a person. It's an institution. And one day you're doing contract negotiations with Joel, and then the next day Joel's fired, and then Joel, now you're dealing with Joseph.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah.
So now you're just like, oh wait, Joseph, aren't you going to honor what I did with Joel? You're like, nah, that was with Joel. Like, this is, I have my own agenda politically. So this is where it gets dicey.
That's the value of, let's say, an institution or a corporation, because if that person is, let's call it an officer, then what you did do with them perpetuates beyond that individual. But anyways, it's a bit of a sidebar, but your point's still valid.
I just want to just comment on, I know we try to bring it in today, to see how we can address that today. But we also got to make sure that we're aware, I'm just using the Mississauga Indians, when those contracts were signed, the British interpret that hey, they gave away the land. And I know in history we can't go back. We can't just Mississauga's Mississauga now.
We can't rewind 200 years.
That's what I'm saying. At that moment, I think that's kind of that's how we interpret that contract, and I think it's important to have that perspective, how you guys were mentioning the proper rights, but also put that in there. Hey, property comes with these contracts, and I think when we read these, as you guys were saying, hey, that's what it says on paper, and was it the best? Was it the worst? I don't know. That's a tough.
I think Darnell, you said it, or Darnell said it, or maybe it was in your email. The point about like the other side of like, was this did both sides interpret the contract the same way? Is sort of what I thought was a sort of an interesting perspective, because arguably they could have been like, can they speak the language well enough to read it properly, to understand? Like, I'm assuming there's a language barrier that they're also negotiating through. And I mean, maybe not, but
I wouldn't. I wouldn't necessarily say that.
Well, but the reason I say language barrier, just think about like the duplicity of terms, right? Like some terms have multiple meanings, and are you using one meaning of the word versus the other one and understanding the other meaning of the word?
Yeah, well, I said, and that's why I brought up the example of 1850, because you had 20 chiefs and numerous renegotiations. So if I say, give me X, no, I'm not going to give you X. Give me B. If you give me B, I'll give you X, and going back and forth. And so I guess the question is this, and this goes to you, Joseph, as well. I already know what Joel's going to say, and to the listener, and this is a good question to ask, is trade always mutually beneficial?
So, I mean, assuming non-coercion.
Yeah, non-coercion. Non-coercion.
So non-coercion, and I wouldn't even have to say properly understood, but to some extent I wanted to go there, but not really, because assuming, like, the idea between trade is if I agree to something voluntarily, that means that I value the thing I'm receiving more than the thing I'm giving up. And the person on the other side, the same way. They value the thing they're receiving more than the thing they're giving up. Whether that's $10 that I gave to the guy to buy lotto scratch tickets, right? Like, I value the lotto scratch ticket more than my $10. And he values my $10 more than the lotto scratch ticket. We are both consider ourselves better off after the trade. So in that sense, yes, mutually beneficial. Now, the counter argument might be, well, it wasn't equally mutually beneficial. And I would say, so what? Why does it have to be equally mutually beneficial? That's actually something totally different than your question. And I don't think it's relevant to answering the question. But anyways.
What would you say, Joseph? Is trade mutually beneficial?
Trade, like just in general, in the broad, like if I give you X and you give me Y.
Yeah. Now, mind you, let's say the trade we do, like, for example, let's talk about X-Men cards, right?
Okay.
Right.
What about Yu-Gi-Oh cards?
No, I'm too old for Yu-Gi-Oh, man. I'm too old for Yu-Gi-Oh. But let's go with the X-Men, right? So, you have a Wolverine, and I got who's a nobody
Cyclops.
X-Men?
Oh, nobody.
Who's a nobody? Like,
I wanted a Magneto card though.
Okay. So let's say you got a I have a Magneto, and you got a Jubilee.
Jubilee, I don't even know who that is. How about the professor? I want the professor.
No, but see, okay, right? But Jubilee, you have to Google that. Jubilee just shoots sparkles. That's about it. I don't know. Just shoots sparkles. All right, like a teenage girl.
I'm gonna try to get rid of this card very quickly.
Yeah, right?
That's his point.
But right, so you have a Jubilee and I got a Magneto, and so I really want that Jubilee, whatever, for whatever reason, to complete my collection, and means a lot to me. I think she's hot, whatever. And the Magneto you're going to get from me will be worth a lot of money, because you don't care about the collection. You care about making money off of it in the future, right? And so we make that trade. Now, of course, once we do the trade, no trade back, stamped it, can stamp it, no black magic, no white magic.
No calling the other guy's mom.
No trade backs, played keepsies.
Long-time listeners will remember that reference for
Yeah, keepsies, all that, stamp it, can stamp it stuff. And so we do the trade. Now, essentially, I got what I want, you got what you want. But technically, in the long run, who's the winner out of that trade? You are. Because you got, not just that you got the Magneto, but the Magneto will be worth money in the future. And in the long run, you were able to buy all this great stuff. And I just got this Jubilee that's not worth anything. The point is that I made a conscious decision to do the trade. and I got what I wanted at the time, and you got what you wanted at the time.
And both of you considered what you were receiving more valuable than what you gave up.
I agree. Yeah, I get what you're saying now. I agree. And like if we bring it back to like the native, the natives are still here, right? Like they didn't get wiped out. Like I remember I was messaging
relatively.
I'm just saying, like it could have been a lot worse. Like Sir John, one of the acts Sir John A. Macdonald was literally to wipe out the Indian race. You cannot own land, 50 acres, if you don't give up your old cultures and old customs. Or Andrew Jackson, like literally trying to get rid of them so they can make more land for immigrants. They're still here, and I'm very happy for that. Then we should be happy for that. Was it a good deal for them? Man, I would not have given away all the stuff that they have given away in hindsight. Like,
but what option would you have had?
Well, no, I was in the corner. I needed to get rid of the card because my people were going to.
Sorry. I thought you talked about land. Sorry.
No. But in the land and the card, the same thing. Like I think at that moment they needed to get that. I needed to give it away. Yes. But I needed to give it away because I needed to make sure that at that moment it was good for me. At that card, I gave you the Magneto, or and I got the Jubilee, and yeah, it sounds very pretty right now, nice land, but then at the end of the day, all I got was food and water and a little bit of land or a little bit of hunting, and I'm still here, right? So. Was it a one-sided deal? I don't think it was because they're still here. Like they still have their people, and but yeah, the British at the end of the day, I think we can all agree that they got the better end of the stick, as you would say.
Yeah, well, and I think we sort of also, the way this conversation we were getting through it, we also, I hope for the listener they realize trying to look back and evaluate a deal from today's perspective is arguably not even something of substance. Like it doesn't help you evaluate what went on, because as we've sort of pointed out, if they hadn't have made the deal, maybe the Americans in the South would have wiped them out, or so the if that happened, we would all say, well, then they should have made the deal, and if they'd made the deal, they would have been better off. Right. And so, again, I sort of made this on the last episode. Someone could counter and say, well, maybe they should have never tried to colonize. But, Darnell, I think you had a really good point where, like, that's easy to say in today's world where we're not living on a sense of survival. Whereas back then, that there was still a cultural or societal sense of like, I have to survive. My people need to survive. I need to, why did they leave Europe to come to North America? For the most part, it was to some extent survival and avoiding oppression.
Mm-hmm. And I would also add, like, as historians, we don't want to presentize the past, or as John Piper says, we don't want to do any chronological snobbery where, okay, well, if I was back then, I would have started a social justice movement and Indigenous Lives Matter, and we would have that's not what happened. And not to get off on a sidebar, but even like your morality, you have to think about, okay, well, what we consider moral today is only based on what the majority says, and it's the same thing back then. What's considered right and wrong back then is what the majority thinks. So if your definition of what's right and wrong now is based on what's cool and trending, then most likely back then you would be that person doing the oppressing because that was considered cool, right? But to move on to the next point, you had a question for Joseph?
Yes. Oh, you want me to ask the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, why I asked? Because one of the parts you guys were talking about the status and non-status, and then you were mentioning how you as a black individual, you always felt like you were not good enough, but you felt like you had that status on you of being black. And then you asked Joel a question. Well, Joel said he put himself in maybe a box of a hockey player and a Christian. And just with all the stuff that's going on today, right? Like I read articles, white supremacy is probably the hottest word in the English book right now, or white supremacist Christianity. So when we say we're Christians, I think maybe it would be good to unbox that, right? Like I always ask people that. They're like, oh, I'm just like, what do you mean by that? What's that word mean? So that was kind of what I wanted to ask Joel. Like, what does he mean? Like, what does he mean when he puts himself in that box or feels like a Christian?
Yeah, and I mean, just to one sort of expand why I was using that was I was trying to draw parallels, right? Like for Darnell to say, identify as Black. I was trying to say, like, for me, I would almost say, like, one, I never like identified as white. I didn't identify as, I mean, I always joked as a kid, like my culture, like I'm a European mutt. Like I have like 8 grandparents and they're all from like different countries, or great grandparents, maybe 8 great grandparents. And they were all like, I think 2 of them totally unrelated on opposite sides are from the same country. So I say all of that to say, like, I was sort of saying, if I'm trying to see what was similar with how I would identify, whereas Darnell would say I identified as Black, I didn't have anything that I could sort of even think was similar. So the next, I sort of thought, okay, Christianity and hockey player was probably like the next closest thing where I sort of would categorize myself there. So and going to, when I say Christian, what's funny is I don't like any of the labels. So for our, super Christian, theological audience, even stuff like Reformed. I mean, I grew up in a Pentecostal church. I would say, like, I don't call myself a Calvinist. I don't call myself Reformed. I don't call myself Pentecostal. I don't call myself charismatic. I'm like, for a while, I think I used the term biblicist because I was like, whatever the Bible says. And that's pretty much my approach. You give me any issue. I don't care what John MacArthur's opinion is. I don't care what, Joel Osteen's opinion is. I value what the basis of any given opinion is, and I test it against the word. And so, for me, when I look back to, let's say early America, and you've got Christians justifying slavery, I would go, well, compared to the word, you're an idiot.
And you're not
right?
a Christian.
So, yeah, and you're not, well, pretend, that's a
okay.
God.
Right.
Because Christians can still be deceived.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, and where, how does God sanctify us? Well, he doesn't sanctify all our sins at once. So, yeah, anyways, I leave it that, for me, I think it's, I would, when I use the term Christian on the show, I would say I'm very intentional about using it in a broad sense because, New Testament says neither Greek nor Jew nor male or female, in the sense that, like, anyone can come to the Lord. There's no immutable characteristic that would prevent you from coming to Christ. And well, that means there's no immutable characteristic preventing you from joining any given church from a biblical sense. The only prevention would be human sense. And so that's why I would use a, generic reference to Christianity or Christian perspective, because I'm trying to sort of set the stage that if you bring up an issue, I can say, okay, well, based on the Bible, how do we evaluate whether you're right or wrong? So I don't know if that encompasses totally. Is there any other follow-up to that?
No, that makes sense. I just want like just people to hear, like, and also to understand, like, when people say Christians, and I know what you're saying that because I know who Darnell is. I know Darnell hangs out with rational Christians and who have a really good heart. Like, we're not out here saying Christians is only for white people, or we'll condemn that. Like, if we read a text, like I think you and I will both read that if we're justifying slavery and you're a Christian and you say slavery is okay, or Christian is only for the white race, we're gonna be like, no, you're an idiot, right? Like, we're gonna be like, you're a moron, right? We're all gonna agree on that. And I just want people to hear that, and I want to hear that. Like, I want to hear that from white Christians whenever we can, right? I think, Darnell, you would agree, right? I think that's something that is important to you too, right? Like,
yeah, and I think, I don't know, and maybe this is some pushback to Joel, because I'm sure some of our colored, I don't necessarily mean black people, but colored listeners would be listening, and they'd probably be like, well, maybe Joel, they'll say, Joel, you're missing the point about being a hockey guy or a Christian guy, or not seeing yourself as a color. But like, the color of our skin, and now I don't believe this, but in general, this is how most people feel. And I felt this way, and not anymore necessarily, but a lot of times people feel like, okay, well, because of the color of my skin determines my status. So the question of status Indians and non-status Indians is that your status is something that I would almost go as far as to say is sacred. It's sacred in that God has given it to you. God has made you this way. And so because of your skin color, you're treated a certain way, and you're given a particular political status or a social status. So when the government recognizes your status, the government is lifting up your ethnicity and your status for the indigenous people. So that's why I'm sure people take the status from government, where they say, okay, look, I need you to acknowledge my ethnicity as First Nations. And so now that you've acknowledged it and the mistreatment historically of my people, I need you to create restitution by giving me some assistance socially to raise my status. And so, yeah, for a lot of people, yeah, and I'm not saying, Joel, I'm not saying, your status as a Christian is not sacred, or, or even hockey person is sacred, but for some people who are colored, that's something you can't escape. And so because of your status determines where you are socially. So this is why most people opt for be a status Indian, responding to my question in the last episode.
Well, and I think, the heart behind why I was trying to draw that parallel was actually to sort of say, I can't even comprehend what that means. Mm-hmm. Right? Because I never had anything that I would even put in the same category. Right? And so I'm drawing a parallel to something I know is different, but it's the closest thing that I can. Right? That's good, and Joel. So, this is where, I have a problem with, I know it's a bit of a sidebar, but this is why I have a problem with the term white privilege. Because it sort of puts the box around a particular type of ignorance. Right? So I know that I'm ignorant to your life experiences, but you're also ignorant to my life experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, totally.
And so white privilege sort of elevates everybody who's, or in essence, actually demotes a certain type of ignorance to being immoral or bad or demonized. Whereas if you have, if you don't have white privilege, you're now sort of elevated, and I would argue you potentially lead to prideful ignorance of the fact that you're now ignorant of when you're in a conversation, right? If you're not willing to recognize that person might have a difficulty understanding where I came from, at the same time, I have a difficulty understanding where they came from, and only one side is doing that, you're hindering the conversation. And so I was just, sort of trying to be real that I can't, and I said it when we did our Is BLM Sin episode, where I had a similar statement where I was when I was talking about the cultural, people say because they were in America, they've lost their because they were slaves, their family lineage, they've lost, where they've come from and the culture. And I made a similar statement, I don't know what that means, because I don't even, I don't go, I said earlier, I have 8 grandparents from different countries. I don't have any country that I'm, or culture or family sort of heritage where I'm if I have something or I can look back to. So my point was in the past, I've made a similar statement where trying to be I can't, it's almost like I'm saying I can't empathize with you because I don't know what it is, or I can't sympathize. I don't know what's the right word there, but.
If I just wanted to okay, so one thing, what people who use those terms, what they say is maybe for a white person, try not to personalize it and just look at it more. This is where I'm trying to read under what's the systemic race, what are they trying to mean by that? And how I have interpreted what they were saying is it's not that they're saying that every personalized, me being white and me having a privilege. It's just looking at it from a systemic view, from an institutional kind of view, and let's look at the CEOs of top 30 companies, or let's look at these trade deals. Do we think this deal with the natives would have been better if the head negotiator on the bidder side was Native American? Because is there some, does it, like, would it have changed, would it have been a more fairer or more understanding? Like, that's kind of what they're saying, is like maybe have a little bit more diversity in there, because it can help. Like, that's what kind of what they're trying to get at, right? You get what I mean by that, by that, Joel, what they're trying to get at?
Well, and this is where we had an episode, Teachers Like Us, on our podcast, and I was arguing, one of the things I started with before we sort of got into an argument, I said, like, I will agree with so much of what you're saying, but I have a problem with the terms, because the terms start to, like white privilege, start to box the conversation in a particular way. So do I think, you know, so to counter your point, diversity of thought is more important than diversity of skin color, right? So the CEOs or the trade deal, having, if you're making a trade deal as a country, having a diverse group of people who represent the diversity of your country in terms of thinking, and the reason I use thinking, because someone with a very different cultural, you know, some cultures value family more, some value other things more. And so having diversity of thought is, I would argue, how you encompass all of these things. But if you do diversity of color or skin color or race or gender, you're actually potentially excluding, because you don't have the diversity of thought as your primary goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's funny that, you know, you talk about like diversity of thought, and you brought up, Joseph, about like Jody Wilson-Raybould and the SNC Lavalin scandal, and she is of an Indigenous background, and you talked about her being the first Native head attorney, and she argued Attorney General, I think, yeah, and she argued for self-government. You want to unpack that idea a little bit more?
Yeah, like when I was trying to get at, like, I feel like because she is from that culture and she understands that, I actually want to listen more to her. I'm going to use another reason why I do think race is important. Let's say an example. I think, Darnell, you know Thomas Sowell. He's African American, so when he actually comments on African American issues, it's just so much more powerful, because I feel like he knows them more. Like he's part of that culture. So when I read parts, not all of it, I read parts of it, Jody Wilson's Raybould books, I'm just like, okay, what's going on? Like, I'm so curious to see, because right, it was a hot topic that time. So, you know, the marketing suckered me, right? Her book was right there. Oh yeah, that's the one who got fired. So good marketing on Indigo. But because her name was always in the news. I had no idea who she was before, right? All I see is Jody Wilson-Raybould every day on that news, right? So I got her book. And what the key point, what I really, and I found it very fascinating, is basically, if I could just summarize her thesis, is like, you need to. I have a quote from her. You guys, you want me to read it? Is that okay? Okay. So the key part from our book is just like, okay, while we must and will address the social issues now, education, child welfare, and health, and consider the immediate needs with respect to closing the financial gap, in truth, the social and economic gaps will never be fully closed until the foundational work of nation, she capitalizes nation, so N, meaning like actually as a nation, rebuilding has been completed, the Indian Act gone, until indigenous people are making decisions for themselves, and until indigenous people are making decisions for themselves. Oh, sorry, I repeated that. Sorry. And until the role of the federal government has been transformed from one of designing and administrating programs and services for indigenous people into one that supports self-governing indigenous nations in a genuine nation-to-nation relationships. In essence, what she's saying is that it's a very bold point. Like what she's saying, if I could just summarize, is she wants the natives to get their land back, but each land that they have is a separate nation, like a separate country inside of Canada, with its own laws, its own self-government, its own system of doing things, while also having a relationship with Canada.
Whoa!
That's the way I interpret that. That's the
no, and that's fine. No, that's fine. I'm saying you interpreted it correctly. I don't know.
That
I got some reservation. I have some reservations.
It's literally a self-government type of thing. Yeah, sorry, continue.
And I would say that is actually mostly what I'm referring to when we were on the last show, and I said, let's try, unique scenarios. And really, what I want to see is a self-government. Now, the dilemma is, do you make them their own nation? Well, then what happens? That's a bit of a squirrely one. How does that play out?
Quebec. Whoa. Right away, I wrote down Quebec. Quebec is praying for that to happen, because as soon as the Supreme Court says, "Oh yeah, nations, you can have your own land," oh my gosh, the can of worms, the Quebec is. Over that. Oh, and I'm actually kind of curious. I hope this kind of happens, because I just think it's just going to explode. But sorry, I know I did agree with what you were saying, Joel. I just put that comment in it just to further improve and to further point on what you were saying, but also from a Native American woman. That's how I kind of wanted to put that in.
No, it's great. Like, because I think the lack of property rights, and I said it on the show, I've said it a bunch of times, like, really, we're talking about socialist experiments, and really they're failing. There's no doubt about it. What's happening right now is failing. So, as you've laid out, as we've talked about, like, doing it with one tribe or one group is, a way to say, hey, is this a productive way to do it? Does that mean you make them part of Canada as opposed to their own nation? I would say, the one counterpoint that I wanted to bring up way earlier was, the Indian Act is also about regulating Indians. It's giving the government control. So even when we talk about self-governance, the government doesn't want to give up the control. They might be willing to give you the property rights, but now they're going to tax you. Right? They're not going to want to give up their, control and influence. That's sort of antithetical to what the government is. So again, that goes back to sort of my point about, like, let's try things, because I don't don't know. I don't see how they would ever get that to pass. Like, being their own nation, just splitting off and taking their own land. To me, it just seems highly unlikely that the, federal government would ever let that happen. Just like they didn't let Quebec try to do the same thing, right?
They got close, though. It was close.
Well, and I mean, I don't know. Maybe it was closer than I remember. I mean, I remember it talked about a lot, but I don't know that it was really that close.
It was like 1%, Joe. Joe, it was like I think 0.5% almost went to. I think it was 50.5 in one referendum to 49.5 or something there like that. It was like a 1% margin.
That's within Quebec, right? Like.
Yes.
That's like phase one. Even if they had the referendum,
that's true.
Get out, now you actually have to do it.
That's
right?
true. That is true.
Yeah, but Joseph, the pushback I would give on Jody
Wilson-Raybould's
comment is that when we look at the definition of self-governance, I'm assuming we're talking about sovereignty.
Yeah, that's her big point. In the books, they need their own land.
Yeah. What does sovereignty mean? Sovereignty means to rule without outside interference. So how can you rule without outside interference when you're asking for outside support? Like Sho Baraka said, we're happy to preach resistance, then turn around and ask for Pharaoh's assistance.
And in the Indian Act, under the legal rights section, which I have it like tagged in our show notes page, if you hover over Indian Act -legal rights, there's a sub comment. It's really called the title, but this is like a quote from that page that to me is exactly along the lines of what you're saying, Darnell. So the Indian Act, the legal rights, restriction on transfer, i.e. not self-sovereignty, restriction on transfer. Every transaction purporting to pass title to any property that is by this section deemed to be situated on a reserve, i.e. any land deemed a reserve, any transaction or any interest in such property is void unless the transaction is entered into with the consent of the minister, or is entered into between the members of a band or between the band and a member thereof. So essentially, you can trade with amongst yourselves, or the government has to sign off on it.
But my main point was that, like, that's a false. I think she has a false definition of what sovereignty and governance actually is, and that when you look at, being sovereign and being independent apart from another nation, and I made the argument last show, like, is that are you saying it's basically what's going on right now? You know, you run your little affairs on the reserve and you get government assistance.
Yeah, so you're saying without the government assistance is the only way that you truly have self-sovereignty or sovereignty.
Yeah.
She would say the transition, you would need help. Like you wouldn't just like let them go. We just, it's like a project. Like you might maybe start with like she's from BC. You'd start with like a tribe that's in the northern BC area, because she'll show examples in her book. She'll show examples of where there is actually self-government going on the reserved land. If you look at Aurelia, the casinos, you guys were mentioning Fraser Institute. There's some millionaire, there's some like multi-million dollar reserves that are like bringing in a huge amount of money because of self-government, because of them actually. And what she's kind of arguing, and she's also saying, is that there needs to be a full out like self-government, because there's some people who still want to be with the
and that's fine, but what I'm saying is that, you know, you can run your little affairs on your reserve, but that doesn't make you a nation. Like, even the argument people make is like, okay, well, they were a nation, a sovereign, self-governing nation prior to, you know, being colonized. But then when it comes down to it, if you are overcome by another nation, are you still a nation? Right? I would argue no. You're not a nation, because
that's what the Israelis say. I look at it. Ask any Israeli.
But I would argue if you've been taken over, and you're not able to run your affairs fully, then you aren't necessarily a nation. Now you can be a band, you can be a tribe, you can be a community, you can be a province. You get what I'm saying? You could be a province, you can be a state, but you can't, you can't be a nation, because you're heavily reliant on the nation, and it's not in a nation's best interest to build up another nation
within their borders,
on their same grounds, within their borders. That makes no sense.
And that was kind of my
point.
It's
tough.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, it's one of those things that it's good conversation to have. But you also brought up the issue of property rights and asking, like, okay, is it wrong for Christians to pursue property? Yeah, is it wrong to pursue property? Like in colonizing, was it wrong in them pursuing property and Christians pursuing property? And you were making an argument from Acts. Yes.
This is where, like, I was telling you guys pre-show, I became a little bit more of a modern. I love property. I think property is something great. I think we'll all agree. I grew up in not I grew up, but we read communist history, right? Communist history, it's very sad, and a big thing was property. So I just want to put a disclaimer before I begin. I just want to make sure that I do think property is good in that Western sense. Now, what I also read doing my own devotions and reading and seeing what other people were saying, I want to start by reading a paragraph from it's a comment on the West and property by Robert Cardinal Serra. I don't know if you guys know, the day is now far spent. He's a cardinal from New Guinea, a black cardinal, and this is what he wrote in his 2019 book. The story of the West is related for us in the gospel through the episode of the rich young man, Mark 10. So he's going to use Mark 10, 17 to 31. He is seeking eternal life. His heart is filled with the desire for happiness. He keeps the commandments. He is the face of the Christian West in the first half of the 20th century, generous and full of great desires. This West sent missionaries into the whole world. And about it, one can say what the gospel says about the young man. Jesus, looking upon him, loved him, verse 21. The Lord adds, inviting him to share his supreme joy and to follow him more closely. You lack one thing. Go, sell what you have and give it to the poor, and follow me, verse 21. Jesus offers the young man a close association with himself. The gospel concludes, at that saying his countenance fell, and he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions, verse 22. There you have the story of the West. It refused at the last moment to give everything. It balked at the supreme sacrifice. It was afraid, held back by its riches, so it sank into sadness. What he was trying to get at that is, I don't know if you guys read in some commentaries, but there's some people who are saying the decline of the West. There's a decline, we don't understand fully, a decline of Christianity, a decline of morality. Some people look at what's happening in the States, the decline of the United States. And in some sense, with the property and this pursuit of wealth, because property, it was this pursuit of wealth, especially with the British people, they were, the essence, trying to get more wealth. I struggle with that at times, and I think as Christians, when we label ourselves as Christians, right, Joe, I label myself as, we have to also make sure that we're aware, we tell, like, this pursuit of this wealth, it can easily lead us astray from God, and it can easily lead us to mass destructions, the destroying of the environment, abusing the poor, slavery, all these type of things, or abusing the natives. That's where I was just kind of getting at that with the property comment, where, like, I think there needs to be some kind of, like, of the free market capitalist approach. I agree with many of those principles, but I also tone it down a little bit, where too much free market, too much free will, too much property seeking, that can be very negative, and I don't know how that can get you closer to God, or closer. St. Augustine would say, whatever you do, do it for God. So if you're buying this land, make sure that you're doing it for God. That's where I was trying to get at with the property. I think that it's important that we mention that, I think, as Christians, or I think it's good to point at what the British were doing. In some sense, they were trying to get more wealth, and that pursuit of wealth did leave, there was a consequence of that.
Yeah, I definitely got a few thoughts, but Darnell, if you want to go first.
Yeah. So no, just as far as, I believe that there is no such thing as sacred and secular, that all things are sacred. So I don't want to say that, the pursuit of property is ungodly, because you also have the passage in, I can't remember the passage, I have to look it up, but Jesus talks about the kingdom of God is like finding a treasure in a field, but in order to get the treasure, you have to, sell everything you got to get that field. You have to purchase that property to get the field, so you can get the treasure that's in the field. And so, yes, there's a way you can.
I was going to say it's an analogy, but if he thought buying the field was immoral, it'd be a really bad analogy.
Yeah. What I'm saying is that there's a point of stewardship where the Lord does give us, and that's what I was saying in the last episode, in my 2 cents, about the cultural mandate and God creating the creation. Even before the fall, he told Adam and Eve to till the land. And actually the foreshadowing of the land was actually the what we see in the temple, was a foreshadowing of the temple. So the Garden of Eden was like the temple that we see in Leviticus and so forth. And so property, tilling the land, I would say that there's nothing wrong with it, but it can definitely be misused.
Yeah, and that's where I think, I would sort of take it in a similar place, where we want to be careful that we don't qualify things the wrong way, right? So what I mean by that is, we would all agree that food could be, the way you interact with food could be sinful, right? The way you interact with other people can be sinful. It doesn't make those things inherently sinful, right? So the simple sense from a Christian perspective is God number one or God number two? Anything that becomes number one over God is sinful in the particular context. And so pursuit of wealth to the point of not listening to the other aspects of Scripture, which talk about, taking care of your neighbor, right? So Philippians 2:4, do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interest of others, right? So if you don't care about your community, and part of that is I'm just looking to acquire my own wealth. Well, the sin isn't the fact that you're acquiring wealth. It's the things you're not doing with the resource God has stewarded to you. And so, is there going to, the question, from a Christian perspective, I would say is like, is the judgment going to come in this lifetime or the next? Right? Are you going, as a Christian, is God going to try to sanctify you and discipline you to use the resources in line with his will? Or are you not a Christian? Right. And again, just in case the listener mistakes what I'm saying to mean you can lose your salvation, different conversation. I don't hold that view, but don't want to go there.
Oh, nice. So you're reformed.
As I said, I don't follow labels.
That's fun.
I don't.
Hey,
don't box me in. Let's look at the text. Don't box me in.
Hey, I'm just saying.
But now what I want to ask you guys, what the British were doing, this expanding of the empire, was it like, I understand, I know you're going to get some historians talk about, oh no, they built trains, they built,
yes.
Well, like what they did in Canada, like this expansion of this empire, was it good? Like, are we gonna say that we're gonna justify? We're gonna say that this pursuit was very good, what they did?
Well, first of all, Joseph. First of all, I want to, you sent us your paper, the Peter Jones paper, which you submitted to Dr. Kraus. The paper.
That was an A. I got an A on that. That was a good paper.
You got an A. Okay, good. That's good. I say all that to say that I had to write a paper for Fott's class. We had Professor Fott on the show talk about Sir John A. Macdonald, and he was asking, was the colonization of the British Empire essentially good or bad? I can't remember. Essentially, was it helpful or not? And you cannot deny the positive impact that the British Empire has brought us, what it has brought the world in regards to industry and innovation.
Well, Industrial Revolution, right? Like that's where it started.
Yeah, you can't deny that. Now,
how would a native reply to that, though?
I think they would say, well, you know what? How would a native reply to that in India? How would a native reply to that in Australia?
That's true. That's
true. You see what I'm saying? So it's
Yeah.
not just Canada. You know what I mean? It's not just Canada, but I think, do you benefit from the modern amenities today? Right? Do you use cars? Right? Do you work in high industry places? Right? The point I'm making is that the point I was going to make is that the British Empire is not the kingdom of God. Right? Jesus is not on the British on the British throne, and he's not trying to make the world a better place. He's not on the British throne trying to make the world a better place. That's not where Jesus is working. Right? So when the British Empire comes, there's going to be bloodshed. There's going to be racism. There's going to be mistreatment. But also there's also going to be positive. And I don't think it's academically honest to sit here and say, all the British Empire has brought is suffering. You cannot honestly say that. You can say that they brought suffering, but also, they brought some positive things. And I think that
people do say that, though,
yes,
Darnell.
okay,
people say that in Native circles, and also Black Lives Matter.
Yes,
you look at they do say that.
Right. But I would say, okay, I put it like this, and I'll let you guys launch in. But my bottom line is this, and this is how I look at history as a historian. These are my convictions, that when we start talking about history, we have to start at the beginning, creation. For some people, history starts with a glob of goo. Right? History starts with a glob of glue.
I thought it starts with a little sperm cell.
Well, their history. He's talking about like.
Hey! Either way from that.
That was a bad joke. You guys are serious. I was trying to put a joke in there.
No, but either way.
Never mind.
From that glob of goo, you have to deduce morality and absolute truth, and so forth, and these metaphysical concepts which govern the way we think, logic, truth, and so forth. I believe that our history starts when God said, let there be light. And he created the earth. And so with that, the Bible isn't just a book on theology, but it's also a history book. And so it tells us the history of people. And the history of people is that we sin. Everybody sin. And there's blood on everybody's hands. The same people who gave us the Torah, the same people who Jesus comes from, were people who were selfish, who slaughtered people, who committed genocide. Do you see what I'm saying? So the point I'm making as a historian, I see history as blood on everybody's hands. There's blood on the British Empire hands, but it would be academically inhonest to say that, okay, before the British Empire, came to Canada, the indigenous people were kicking it, and everything was a utopia.
It was complete peace, no bloodshed.
Yeah, it was complete peace, complete peace. And nobody ate meat, right? Everybody was environmentalist. Everybody shared everything. It was socialistic. Come on, man. That's not true, right? Same thing. People say, oh yeah, before white people came to Africa, black people were buddies. Everybody was cool. No, we weren't all cool. And we're not all cool today. Nobody's all cool. There's blood on everybody's hands. That's my point. So I don't think it's academically honest to say, oh, well, this group did everything all bad, or this group did everything all good. I believe good history, like a good historian, will always point out the positive and the negatives in every group. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think with regards to the colonization / expansion of the empire, there's a dilemma of, well, okay, if they want to acquire land or grow, did they, we go back to did they make a fair trade? Was it a mutually beneficial trade? Obviously there's an aspect of, well, they started war, and then in order to stop warring, they tried to come up with a deal, and so maybe that sort of precludes it from being a fair trade because it's by coercion to some extent. Like, I would say I'm willing to listen to that argument, but I think Darnell's got a really good point that it's not like they were the only one expanding their land through bloodshed. Arguably every tribe was doing that to some regard or another, right? Oh no, you're not allowed to raise your cattle on our land. Like, go and beat them with your lacrosse sticks or whatever. I say that as a joke because I swear I learned that lacrosse used to be a bloody 24-hour game that the winner was the one that was left alive. Anyways, total sidebar. I think it's a really, really good point to sort of finish, especially a conversation where we're touching on the historical, or with what Darnell's saying. You have to be a good historian. A good historian's essentially, let's say, steel manning all positions, pointing out the good, pointing out the bad, and recognizing that, I think you use the term presentizing the history is just foolishness. Because it doesn't all it does is sort of pronounce morality or pronounce your moral position. It doesn't actually produce anything productive.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, Joel, I would also add that, what? There's only one hero in history, and that's the Lord Jesus Christ. He's the only hero in history that has no blood on his hands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And from a sin perspective,
right? That's good history.
He has no sin. The rest of us, we all have sin, which one way or another, that means we have blood on our hands.
Mm-hmm. And the only blood he has on has on his hands is because of us dying for his own. But anyways, go ahead.
I'm good.
Oh no, I agree. Yeah, I was just listening, and I think that was a wonderful point. I think all the comments were addressed, and I think it was wonderful. And thank you.
Yeah. No. Thank you, Joseph. Because you know what, the way how things go these days, there's a lot of people who will gladly disagree with you and send you a letter or leave a comment saying they disagree with you, but people rarely will ever, come onto a person's platform and discuss it. So thank you for writing it, and thank you for accepting our invitation and coming to expound on your ideas and give us some pushback. And so thank you.
Yeah, and this is one of the a good example of the Sixth Sense doing what we try to do, which is represent our 2 cents, but also the audience 2 cents. And obviously, you're one of the, audience members. So we definitely appreciate that. And obviously that's sort of hopefully a call or encouragement to the audience, like reach out to us, give us your 2 cents. We might not be able to invite you on the show, but even give us ideas for further conversation, or even just, feel free to tell us when the audio sucks so we do better, or it's simple things like that. So, hit us up, sixcentsreport@gmail.com and Sixth Sense Report on Twitter, Facebook.
Yeah. And also, sorry, Joseph, in case of people want to get in touch with you because they're blown away by you as a historian, what are your platforms in case somebody wants to join the Joseph bandwagon?
I just YouTube, man. That's all. I talk to myself on the camera.
Okay. So what's your YouTube channel? Yeah. So what's your YouTube channel?
Let me find it. I think you just got to search my name.
Oh my gosh, this is so unprofessional, man.
Oh my God, I know. I'm trying to kind of keep a I'm trying not to get fired from work. I gotta make sure. This is supposed to be a little discreet. All you gotta do is just search my name, J.A.R.A.C.Z. Right now, I only got my fiance listening in, making sure that I'm not blasting our relationship or something like that. So I only got like a couple of viewers or something like that. But it's something I just do ventilate. It's actually my like a self-therapy type of thing. We get bombarded with media, we get bombarded with messages, we get bombarded with, there used to be a time where you just talk to yourself and you just let it all out, you know what I mean? Just like, be like, okay, what am I really thinking? Because sometimes you think of your thoughts, you're like, man, those are some sick, stupid thoughts. You gotta let that go out, right? So it's kind of my self-therapy kind of more, and just yeah.
Okay, well, who knows? Maybe it might turn in to the Joseph show. You never know, man. Yeah, but thank you. You're well read. Thank you, brother. You're well read. And we love that. You brought some books for us to look at, and you brought the quotes. So thank you.
Yeah. Respects, and I'll definitely link that in the show notes. Maybe I'll get you a couple more viewers.
Oh yes, good. Thank you.
Yeah. No problem, man. All right, so our listeners, our Six Centers, let us know what you guys thought about this episode. Was there anything we missed? You never know. You might be next contestant on Sixth Sense Report.
6 cents makes change.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?